Hey guys, tonight, we're floating back to a time when the world was obsessed with elegance, invention, and very poor medical decisions. So, dim the lights, exhale, and settle in. Because tonight, our story is about how a simple South American leaf found its way into European teacups, doctors' kits, royal pantries, and eventually into the veins of history itself. This is the sleepy, powdered tale of how cocaine quietly seduced the world. As most powerful people, from doctors in Vienna to queens in palaces, and left a faint trail of glittering disaster. Let's start where all great bad ideas begin, with rich people and optimism. In the mid-1800s, Europe was high on science, literally and figuratively. Every few months, someone in a waistcoat would discover a new miracle chemical that could apparently cure anything: depression, headaches, heartbreak, you name it. The Victorians loved their tonics, and stimulants were basically just drinks that could knock out a horse. Somewhere in this glorious chaos, a group of German chemists got their hands on a leaf that had been chewed in the Andes for thousands of years, the coca leaf. Indigenous people had used it to fight altitude sickness and hunger for centuries. It was a normal, cultural, everyday thing. But of course, the Europeans took one look and said, what if we distill it into pure powder and snort it? Because of course they did. Enter Albert Niemann, a young German chemist in 1860, who isolated the active ingredient in the coca leaf. He named it cocaine, a name that, even then, sounded like something that should have come with a warning label. Niemann wrote about its numbing effects, how it made his tongue tingle. The irony. He died a few years later of a lung disease before seeing what his discovery would become. But his little white powder, that would go on to ruin families, finance empires, and accidentally fund the creation of a major soft drink. Fast forward 20 years. It's now the 1880s, and Europe has entered what historians politely call the Age of Nerves. Everyone was stressed. Industrial life, long work hours, the rise of urban misery, and no one was sleeping. Wealthy people were desperate for something to lift their spirits. Enter cocaine, marketed as a harmless pick-me-up. You could buy it at any pharmacy. It was mixed into lozenges, tonics, wine, and even cigarettes. Doctors prescribed it for melancholia and nervous exhaustion, which is just Victorian code for I'm tired of existing. Now let's glide over to Vienna, the home of one of history's most famous overthinkers, Sigmund Freud. Freud, before he became the father of psychoanalysis, was a young neurologist with a fascination for how drugs affected the mind. In 1884, he got his hands on cocaine and thought, this stuff could change medicine. He called it a magical substance. He wrote entire papers praising it, how it made him feel confident, alert, euphoric. He gave it to friends, patients, even his fiancée. He honestly thought it could treat everything from depression to morphine addiction. Spoiler, it didn't. One of Freud's close friends, an eye surgeon named Ernst von Fleischermacher, was addicted to morphine. Freud tried to cure him with cocaine. You can probably guess how that went. The poor man ended up addicted to both, shaking, hallucinating, insects crawling under his skin, and dying young. Freud quietly stopped mentioning that part in his later works, but the damage was done. The medical community had taken the bait. Cocaine became fashionable, even chic. By the 1890s, royalty had joined the fun, because nothing said refined taste like casually drinking narcotics. In England, Queen Victoria's court was obsessed with health tonics. Her personal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, famously said that a small dose of cocaine can be most beneficial. So yes, the Queen's doctor literally endorsed it. And given Victoria's fondness for medicated wines, it's possible she tasted it herself, though she was probably too proper to say so out loud. Meanwhile, in France, a certain chemist named Angelo Mariani had the bright idea to mix Bordeaux wine with coca leaves. He called it Vin Mariani, and it was a hit. The drink combined the mellow buzz of wine with the kick of cocaine, a kind of 19th century energy drink for the rich. Everyone drank it. Pope Leo XIII had his own custom bottles. He even gave Mariani a gold medal for his service to humanity. Imagine, the Pope handing out awards for cocaine, wine. That's where we were as a species. Across the Atlantic, an American pharmacist named John Pemberton tried to make his own version of Vin Mariani. His drink was called Pemberton's French wine coca. It contained cocaine, caffeine, and alcohol, a breakfast of champions. Then, when alcohol got banned in Atlanta, he swapped the wine for sugar syrup. The result? Coke. Yes, The world's most famous soda started life as a cocaine tonic. Early bottles contained around 9 milligrams of cocaine per serving. Not enough to make you see colors, but enough to make housewives clean the kitchen twice. Coca-Cola quietly removed the cocaine by 1904, but by then, the brand name Coca had already immortalized its origin story. Back in Europe, cocaine wasn't just a medical fad anymore, it was fashionable sin. Aristocrats sprinkled it on their soirees the way we might pass around champagne. It became a mark of modernity, intellect, and sophistication. "I take a little for energy," they'd say, like it was vitamin C. Artists loved it too. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson supposedly wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde during a cocaine binge, which suddenly explains a lot. Musicians used it to stay awake for long nights of performance. Painters thought it expanded their creativity, though it mostly expanded their delusions. But as usual, what starts in drawing rooms eventually trickles down, literally. By the turn of the century, cocaine addiction was a social epidemic. Doctors who once prescribed it were now trying to cure it. Newspapers ran moral panic stories about cocaine fiends. Yet the irony was thick. The same upper class that had normalized it now wanted it gone. Governments stepped in. In 1912, the Hague Convention became one of the first international drug control treaties aimed at limiting cocaine and opium trade. It didn't work immediately, but it set the stage for modern narcotics law. Still, the damage to public health and elite reputations was done. The substance that had once graced royal tables was now seen as dirty, criminal, and dangerous. But let's float gently to another royal connection, because the British weren't done making bad choices. By the early 20th century, members of the House of Windsor were still quietly fond of chemical stimulants. During World War I, cocaine was widely used by soldiers and by certain aristocrats who needed a bit of courage before official functions. In elite London circles, it became the discreet indulgence of the bored and the powerful. Even later, whispers followed royals like Princess Margaret, whose social circle in the mid-20th century dabbled in a bit of powdered fun. Nothing ever proven, of course, but the image stuck. Cocaine had gone from doctor's cure to the party drug of the elite, keeping its old reputation for exclusivity and ruin. By now, the story of cocaine had transformed from a South American plant to a European miracle drug to a global symbol of vanity and downfall. It had built dynasties of addiction, toppled reputations, and financed modern empires far darker than any royal house. And we're only halfway through this sleepy spiral, because next, we drift toward the early 20th century, when the drug left the palaces and entered the underworld. When fallen aristocrats, doctors, and dreamers became the bridge between high society and organized crime. But for now, take a slow breath. The night is long, and history is kind of high. If you're still awake, first of all, congratulations, and second, get comfortable because we're drifting into the early 20th century now. The part of history where cocaine stopped being a fashionable hobby for the upper class and started becoming, well, a global problem. The powdered dream that once sat politely on silver trays in royal salons was about to find itself traded in back alleys, smuggled across oceans, and stuffed into suitcases by men who didn't own palaces, but certainly wanted the money of those who did. Let's float there, shall we? It's the early 1900s. The age of corsets and carriages is dying. Empires are cracking. Europe is starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, letting every doctor hand out powdered stimulants wasn't a great idea. By 1914, the United States had passed the Harrison Narcotics Act, regulating opium and cocaine for the first time. It wasn't an outright ban, but it meant your friendly neighborhood pharmacist could no longer legally sell you a pick-me-up tonic that made your heart race like a steam engine. In Britain, similar restrictions followed. What was once a social tonic now belonged to the world of contraband. And here's the twist: when the law steps out, the black market steps in. During World War I, cocaine use actually skyrocketed. Soldiers on both sides used it to stay awake during long battles. The British Army issued it under the cheerful name Forced March Tablets, because nothing says team morale like government-issued stimulants. When the war ended, thousands of men came home with a little extra baggage, and not just trauma. Addiction was quietly spreading through post-war Europe, and the governments had no idea what to do about it. So, naturally, they blamed the usual suspects: foreigners, the lower class, and jazz musicians. In 1916, the London Times published a moral panic article claiming that Chinese and black men were using cocaine to corrupt white women. It was pure racist hysteria, but it worked. Public opinion turned sharply against the drug. Suddenly, the same upper class that used to sip coca wine was clutching their pearls about degeneracy, a neat little circle of hypocrisy. Meanwhile, in the real world, the drug trade had already gone underground, quietly building networks that connected old colonial ports, forgotten warehouses, and a new kind of entrepreneur, the smuggler. Let's drift to the 1920s, the age of jazz, prohibition, and sparkly disasters. Cocaine found a new home in nightclubs and speakeasies. It was glamorous again, but in a different way. No more marble bathtubs and chandeliers. Now it was silk dresses, jazz bands, and cigarette smoke curling around mirrored bars. It was also illegal, which only made it more attractive. People have a weird habit of wanting what they can't have, especially rich people. So while the working class was getting hammered on bathtub gin, the elite of New York, Paris, and Berlin were quietly snorting their evenings away behind velvet curtains. The irony, it was often the same families who, a generation earlier, had banned the stuff. And here's where the dynasty part of our story gets darker. Because cocaine wasn't just an indulgence anymore, it became a symptom of decline. Aristocrats across Europe were struggling to stay relevant. Their fortunes were fading, their empires collapsing, and their estates rotting. Many of them turned to drugs out of boredom, loneliness, or sheer existential dread. In post-war Germany, for instance, members of the fallen Hohenzollern and Austrian noble families were whispered to be quietly addicted. Their old world was gone, replaced by republics and ration cards. Across the ocean, wealthy Americans, oil heirs, movie stars, socialites, started picking up where the European royals left off. Cocaine became the rich person's rebellion, the unspoken symbol of someone who had everything except meaning. Meanwhile, the business side of things was growing faster than anyone could imagine. In the 1930s, much of the global coca leaf trade still came from Peru and Bolivia. But now, the refining, the actual turning of leaves into powder, was happening under the radar. Smuggling routes formed through Argentina, Cuba, and Europe. Even the Nazis got involved. Yes, really. During World War II, Germany experimented with stimulants for soldiers, mostly methamphetamine. But cocaine wasn't off the list. The logic was simple. If it keeps you awake, it's useful. There's something bleakly poetic about humanity's talent for turning chemistry into catastrophe. After the war, cocaine vanished from polite conversation. The 1950s were the era of repression, pearl necklaces, cold wars, and suburbia. Publicly, nobody talked about cocaine anymore. Privately, it never left the party. Hollywood stars used it quietly. Politicians whispered about it. Certain doctors kept it handy for creative burnout. But officially, the world pretended it didn't exist. Until, of course, the 1970s happened. Ah yes, the 70s, when everything the Victorians feared actually came true, but with better music. Cocaine made a triumphant return, and this time it didn't even pretend to be medicine. It was pure glamour, the drug of the beautiful, the rich, and the desperately empty. At Studio 54, celebrities danced until dawn, fueled by mountains of white powder. Wall Street traders in the 80s started their mornings with espresso, and their afternoons with something a little stronger. The irony, this was just history repeating itself. Victorian doctors and 80s bankers had the same problem. Too much confidence and not enough sex. But beneath the glitter, something darker was brewing, literally, in jungle labs. In the 1970s and 80s, cocaine production became industrialized in Colombia. The Medellin and Cali cartels turned it into a global business worth billions. They controlled plantations, shipping routes, and politicians. They also unleashed chaos on their own countries. And while Pablo Escobar was bombing judges and buying entire neighborhoods, his buyers weren't revolutionaries. They were the same old faces, aristocrats, businessmen, entertainers, and heirs. Cocaine had come full circle. Once again, it was the powder of dynasties. Only now, they weren't royal by birth. They were royal by money. Let's pause there. Because if you look closely, the story of cocaine is basically a mirror for power. In the 19th century, it gave energy to empires. In the 20th, it helped the rich forget that those empires were gone. And by the 21st, it became the quiet companion of a global elite that still thinks it's untouchable. The powder didn't corrupt dynasties, it exposed them. And here's the sleepy irony. All of this started because a few German chemists wanted to make a better medicine, and because a few royal doctors thought their patients could use a little pick-me-up. From palaces to prisons, from wine to white lines, cocaine's story is just humanity's endless attempt to fix its own boredom. Let's flow toward the modern era next, where we'll see how the legacy of aristocratic addiction shaped not just empires, but economies, pop culture, and even how we define success. But for now, take a breath, and maybe be grateful that your evening beverage doesn't contain 7 milligrams of regret. If you're still with me, your patience is already stronger than most European monarchies were. So, settle in again, take a slow breath, maybe sip something that isn't laced with coca leaves. Tonight, we're floating into the modern world, the age of airports, record labels, luxury yachts, and suspiciously energetic billionaires, because while kings and queens once whispered about their medical tonics, today's rulers of the world have PR teams, NDAs, and private jets to hide the same old habits. The drug may have changed names and packaging, but the story, it's still the same. When the 1980s began, cocaine was no longer just a drug, it was an accessory. In Manhattan, people joked that the city ran on two things, coffee and cocaine. On Wall Street, brokers bragged about pulling all-nighters, which really meant they were vacuuming lines off glass tables in expensive apartments. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, actors and musicians were doing the same thing, only with better lighting. Every generation likes to believe it's smarter than the last. But here, the rich were once again doing exactly what their great-grandparents had done, consuming the same chemical under new branding, with the same denial that anything bad could happen. Cocaine was marketed unofficially, of course, as clean, sophisticated, and modern. Unlike heroin, which was associated with poverty and crime, cocaine had an image problem in reverse. It looked too glamorous to be dangerous. Magazines called it the champagne of drugs. Fashion photographers captured models at parties with a haze of white powder around them, pretending it was just dust. And much like the Victorian nobles who once praised it as a tonic for exhaustion, the 80s elite framed it as productivity fuel, a way to keep working, creating, performing. It wasn't just a party drug, it was the illusion of control. But beneath the glass towers and gold records, there was blood. Every gram of cocaine that passed through a nightclub in London or Miami came from a chain of violence that stretched thousands of miles from coca farmers in Peru and Bolivia to the jungle labs of Colombia to the smuggling routes through Central America. And at the top of that chain were men like Pablo Escobar, who ruled the Medellin cartel like a medieval king. He had his own private zoo, his own army, his own laws. He built schools and bombed courthouses. Escobar wasn't just a criminal, he was a new kind of aristocrat, a man whose wealth could rival nations, built entirely on the same powder that once decorated royal vanity tables. The world watched in shock, or at least pretended to, because while governments condemned him, millions of dollars from his trade quietly flowed through Western banks. The system that once banned cocaine now profited from laundering its money. It was a full-circle moment for hypocrisy. By the 1990s, the drug's image had started to crack. The deaths of musicians, actors, and business moguls exposed the darker side of what had once been called glamorous. Rehab centers became the new confessionals of the elite. And yet, the market kept growing. The truth was uncomfortable. Cocaine was no longer a niche indulgence. It was infrastructure. Let's pause for a moment and drift back, not to palaces this time, but to boardrooms. Because the new dynasties weren't royal families anymore. They were corporations, media empires, record labels, luxury brands. The children of old nobility had been replaced by CEOs and influencers, but the hunger for stimulation, power, and escape was the same. In a strange way, cocaine became the invisible fuel of capitalism. It made people feel faster, sharper, invincible, at least until it didn't. And if you look closely, that's the same delusion that destroyed every royal house in history, believing that control is eternal. By the early 2000s, cocaine use had spread into every social layer. What had once been a symbol of aristocracy was now a cheap thrill. Street purity dropped, prices rose, and the violence in producer countries worsened. But among the global elite, the habits remained oddly unchanged. Private islands, secret parties, offshore accounts, the new Versailles, just with better Wi-Fi. Tabloids would occasionally out a celebrity scandal, a politician's bad night, or a royal relative caught on camera doing a suspiciously familiar ritual over a table, the public would gasp for a week, then forget, because scandal fatigue is one of the few things more addictive than cocaine itself. And if we're being honest, the old dynasties never really left, they just evolved. Members of European royal families today may not be snorting lines in drawing rooms, but their distant ancestors' legacies still echo in every luxury product tied to excess. The global trade in wealth, image, and indulgence, that's the modern version of empire. Cocaine just happens to be its ghost. Let us float back to where it all started, to that quiet green leaf in the Andes. For centuries, the coca plant had been sacred, a gift from nature used respectfully by indigenous peoples to endure harsh conditions. It wasn't a symbol of vice or vanity. That meaning came later, courtesy of European curiosity and colonial extraction. When you think about it, cocaine's story is just another colonial story. Something natural, cultural, and balanced turned into a commodity, exported, refined, and eventually weaponized by those who thought they knew better. The irony. It ended up enslaving the same kind of people who first exploited it. Queens, bankers, presidents, all undone by the thing they once thought they could control. Even today, traces of that old arrogance remain. Luxury magazines casually reference cocaine chic. Movies still romanticize the 1980s drug scene. The same cycle of glamour and ruin spins on, just with better filters. And somewhere, in a quiet mountain village in Peru, a farmer still chews coca leaves for energy, unaware that his ancient tradition once corrupted entire dynasties an ocean away. So, if you ever hear someone say history repeats itself, this is what they mean. A leaf turned into powder, a medicine turned into a weapon, a habit turned into empire. From Freud's notebook to the Queen's tonic to Wall Street's nose, cocaine has been humanity's favorite illusion of control for nearly 2 centuries. It built reputations, destroyed families, and funded both revolutions and mansions. And through it all, the pattern stayed the same. The powerful always think they can handle it. They never do. So, as we drift toward the end of this sleepy story, maybe it's worth remembering that history isn't just about kings and wars. Sometimes, it's about what those kings snorted before breakfast. Because empires may fall for many reasons. Greed, pride, politics, but sometimes, they just run out of powder. If you're still here, you've officially outlasted most royal bloodlines. So, settle in one last time. Let's slow down, breathe out, and drift together through the quiet aftermath of everything that came before. Because this isn't really a story about drugs. It's a story about people, and how we keep repeating the same patterns, century after century, convinced that this time we're different. Spoiler, we're not. Every empire has its addiction. For the Romans, it was power. For the Victorians, it was progress. For us, maybe it's productivity, the need to always do more, earn more, be more. Cocaine just happened to be the perfect mirror for all of that. It promised energy, focus, and brilliance. It offered control, that sweet illusion that you could keep everything running just a little longer. That's why doctors loved it. That's why queens endorsed it. That's why bankers, actors, and politicians still fall for it. Because it whispers the same lie every time. You're in charge, and people who already have too much power are usually the easiest to fool. Let's drift back for a moment to those royal courts, the candlelit ones, filled with lace and powdered wigs and self-importance. Imagine a physician standing beside a velvet throne, holding a small vial of white powder. He tells the queen it will cure her nerves, help her sleep, make her sharper. He truly believes it. So does she. A few centuries later, the throne is gone. The palace is now a skyscraper. The doctor is a therapist, the vial a glass tube, the queen a CEO. And yet the ritual is the same. A powerful person, anxious about losing control, takes a powder that promises they'll never have to. Human progress just with better lighting. When you look at it this way, cocaine's history is weirdly comforting. Not because it's good, but because it's familiar. Every generation thinks it's inventing something new, ambition, burnout, anxiety, excess. But these are just different costumes for the same old human restlessness. The royals didn't snort cocaine because they were evil. They did it because they were bored, insecure, and terrified of irrelevance. Which, when you think about it, isn't that different from anyone else. The only difference is that their mistakes were recorded in oil paintings, while ours end up in Google search results. Let's talk about that word corruption. When we say cocaine corrupted dynasties, we imagine scandal, decay, downfall. But the truth is gentler and sadder. Cocaine didn't corrupt them, it revealed them. Every monarch, every tycoon, every genius who fell into it was already searching for something missing: peace, escape, validation, meaning. The powder just made the search faster, louder, and shorter, and the empires they built, royal, financial, criminal, were just reflections of the same illusion. The idea that enough wealth, or work, or white powder could fill the quiet spaces inside. It never could. Still, history isn't all tragedy. It's also incredibly patient. After every fall, someone always rebuilds. After every addiction, a new kind of awareness forms. After every royal scandal, someone writes a bedtime monologue about it, apparently. So maybe that's progress, in its own sleepy way. Today, cocaine still exists, of course, just like vanity, ambition, and insomnia. But its royal glow is gone. The powder that once decorated palace tables now sits at the center of police statistics and cautionary tales. Yet if you look closer, its ghost is everywhere: in the coffee culture, in the obsession with productivity, in the worship of energy. We still chase stimulation. We still crave control. We just changed the packaging. The addiction was never to the drug itself. It was to the feeling of being untouchable. So, if there's a moral here, and I say this very gently, because bedtime stories don't really need morals, it's this: history doesn't judge. It just repeats until we start paying attention. Maybe the real lesson from cocaine's royal adventure isn't don't do drugs, though that's obviously solid advice. Maybe it's stop pretending you're invincible. Because whether you wear a crown, a suit, or a hoodie, the story ends the same way. The powder fades, the rush stops, the empire cracks, and in the quiet that follows, we all have to face the same thing ourselves. So, take a breath. Let the lights dim a little more. The queens are gone. The chemists are gone. Even the cartels rise and fall. What remains are the stories, soft reminders that power is temporary, and peace is something you can't buy, bottle, or inhale. And with that, our powdered little empire drifts off into history. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be pleasantly boring. If you're still listening, thank you. That means you made it through centuries of medicine, madness, and monarchy, and somehow, you're still awake enough to care. This last part isn't about history anymore. It's about what happens after history. The quiet space where the noise fades, and only the echoes remain. Cocaine has a strange afterlife. It's not gone, not really. It lingers like perfume in an empty ballroom, faint but recognizable. It lives in our language, in phrases like energy, grind, hustle. We've replaced the powder with caffeine, dopamine, and notifications. Different substances, same craving. Because underneath every empire, there's always a heartbeat that won't slow down. Let's drift back for a moment. Picture one of those royal drawing rooms again: velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, a gramophone whispering through static. Everyone in the room looks composed, but their hands tremble. Their eyes move too fast. Their laughter doesn't quite land. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, time feels suspended. That's the illusion cocaine always sold, that you could outrun the clock. That exhaustion was optional. That time, and decay, and death could be postponed with just one more line. Of course, history had other plans. When the powder finally wore off, most of those empires collapsed quietly. Not with drama, just fatigue. Palaces emptied. Fortunes vanished. Names faded from textbooks. And in their place, silence returned. That's the part history never dramatizes: the morning after. The curtains open. The sunlight hits the table. The white powder is gone. And for the first time in years, the air smells clean. It's funny, the same species that invented cocaine also invented lullabies. Maybe that says something about balance, about how we always swing between chaos and calm, stimulation and sleep. Maybe that's why you're here, too, listening to a story about something loud, told in a whisper, trying to understand it just enough to let it go. In the end, cocaine's story is just a small thread in the much larger tapestry of human wanting. We want to feel alive. We want to matter. And sometimes, we confuse movement with meaning. But meaning lives in the pauses, in the moments we stop chasing, stop performing, stop pretending we're unstoppable. Maybe that's what the royals never learned. And maybe, if you're hearing this now, you just did. So, as this story fades into the background, let it go. Let the names blur, let the palaces dissolve, let the powder scatter. All that's left is quiet. And in that quiet, there's something better than power. There's peace. Good night, traveler. The empires are sleeping, and so should you. The end.